Hey, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Mama Pies Before the Lesson podcast. I'm your host, Carlos Smiley. Now, last week, we heard the Apostle Paul put things into perspective. He acknowledged his privilege and the successes that his birthright had brought him, his education, his family position within the community, his ability to attend the best schools, train under the best professors, his opportunities to get connected into the most exclusive country clubs, which then gave him access into the good old boys club. His associations had taken him far in his life and were poised to position him for life. But when he met Jesus on the Damascus Road, when Jesus knocked him down, turned him around, and set his feet on solid ground, when Jesus told him that he knew he was Saul, he acknowledged his background and showed him that none of those things were disqualifiers for his new assignment. Paul ultimately came to the realization that none of it meant anything to him either. In verse 7, he tells him that, but what things were gain to me, those I count loss for Christ. Paul's press was now on to his next. You see, the world saw an egotistical, privileged politician and lawyer hiding behind rules and regulations as he exacted punishment on whomever he deemed wasn't following the laws. But God, through his son Jesus Christ, saw his appointed apostle to the world. Jesus then places Saul/Paul on the street called Straight. He opened his eyes and then took him into the wilderness of Arabia for basic training. And after 3 years, when he knew that Paul could endure, that Paul could walk it like he talked it, when Paul could finally make his calling and elect sure, then Jesus unleashed him to go and preach the gospel in season and out of season, to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to document the goodness of God. And in doing the work of the Lord, in communing with Jesus in his secret place, in relying solely on Jesus in his public places, Paul got to know Jesus in the fellowship of his suffering and in the power of his resurrection. On Sunday, the title of the lesson is Stand Firm. Scriptural basis of our lesson continues to be Philippians, the 3rd chapter. So the question that I have, and maybe you do too, is how did we get from there to here? From an assessment of this life's value on material things, this life's worldly promotions and positioning, from Paul concluding that this life's stuff, as juxtaposed against the excellency of the knowledge of Jesus Christ, it ain't worth the paper that it was written on. So how do we go from there now to a challenge to raise our level of thinking, to open our minds and our hearts to an even higher level of intellect, to an honest assessment of ourselves to arrive at the conclusion that we ain't there yet, while at the same time accepting that urging from deep down within our souls to continue to run the race. Don't look back. What's done is done. We need to focus on the finish, pressing toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Jesus Christ. Hopefully, after today's conversation, we'll better understand what our biblical heroes were dealing with, their sleepless nights, their worrisome days, the care that they put into their purpose-driven lives, the for God I live and for God I die mindset that they had made their mantra. So if you like what you hear, click the button below and subscribe to our channel. Now let's dig into this thing and see can't we figure it out. This week, as we continue in the book of Philippians, we've got to view it from the standpoint of the writer, in the spirit that it was written in. It's one contiguous letter. We ended last week's lesson with verse 11. We begin this week's lesson with verse 12. The tone and the tenor hasn't changed. Paul continues to admonish the saints at Philippi, and us as well, to keep rising in the knowing of Jesus Christ. Because after all that Paul had done in the furtherance of the gospel, He was writing these words from a jail cell in Rome. Paul had risen to some of the highest heights, but he had also found himself in some of the lowest lows. So he knew both how to be abased and how to abound. Paul is clear in telling the church that by no means had he already reached or attained his goal. Paul knew his shortcomings. Paul knew that through all of his actions, his works, his merit, and his righteousness, in and of himself, he still couldn't attain anything eternal, that is. But it was only through the actions, the works, the merits, and the righteousness of Jesus Christ, sacrificing his life on the cross, that the charges against him and us could be dropped. Paul knew that he was known throughout the region, having started churches. His oratory was on par with Apollos, worked with men throughout the region to make change in the world. But in spite of all of that, he had no false sense of having arrived. He knew his past, but he didn't dwell on it. It was what it was. His goal, his sole objective in life, was to see Jesus in the power of his resurrection. Some people in the church at Philippi thought that they had achieved their goal of Christian perfection. They had been, on the deacon board, the mother's board, part of the YPWW. They taught Sunday school. They were the tribe leader that raised the most money, and so on and so forth. But Paul was letting them know that even with all that he had brought to and given to the church, he was by no means perfect, sinless, or even holy. Paul knew that this was a race that wasn't given to the swift or to the strong. Rather, it was given to the one that endured to the end. The race wasn't over. But as Paul told them in verse 12, but I follow after, if that I may apprehend that for which also I am apprehended of Jesus Christ. He's letting them know that he can't rest on what he did yesterday. It's a daily walk to fulfill the call of God through Jesus Christ. I tell you, it would be easy for me to sit back and think that I did okay last week in writing these words. It would be easy for me to rest on what Sister So-and-so and Brother So-and-so had to say about how good it was last week. But there's a calling on my life to tell the good news of Jesus Christ in the unique way, shape, and form in which God has given it to me. I gotta do it. Jeremiah said, it's just like fire shut up in my bones, and I'm weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. If only one hears a message, or 1,000, I still got to talk about it. Paul wasn't stuck on stupid. He knew that he had to stay focused. He knew that everything in his life race was temporal and perishable. But in running the race with Jesus standing at the finish line, his prize was imperishable and eternal. That's why he told the church at Philippi to be earnest and mature about their status, willing to admit their shortcomings, be open to correction, and most importantly, be willing to be recreated in Jesus Christ. He then pivots to collectively encourage them and himself. Let those of us who are mature think this way. And if anything you think otherwise, God will reveal that also to you. Only let us hold true to what we have attained. Because Paul had told them at the end of the day, it brings him to tears when he thinks about those folk, those people that walk as enemies of Christ. He simply states that their end is destruction. So on Sunday, we will arrive at and stand firm on the conclusion that there are two things we've got to forget from our yesterdays: our defeats and our victories. When it comes to our defeats, we have to forget all of the hurt from our past, the mistreatment, the self-inflicted stuff that we allowed to rule in our past. Let God kiss away the pain. Relative to our earthly victories, they're fleeting. We have to put ourselves under the forgiveness of God and also forgive ourselves. We've got to hand all of our past stuff, the good, the bad, and the ugly, over to Jesus Christ. If Jesus dropped the charges, why can't we? Looking forward to next week's lesson as we go back in and dig a little deeper here on the Before the Lesson podcast. Remember to subscribe to our Mama Pie Sunday School class YouTube channel. And until next time, be blessed.
I was guilty of all the charges, doom and disgrace. But Jesus, with His special love, saved me.